to LFR soon, to Detective Chief Constable Mark Travis from South Wales Police, which use the software, and also from Lindsay Chiswick, Director of Intelligence from the Met Police Service, which also use the software. So we all have questions for you, and I'm afraid we've got more questions than time, which is almost inevitable in everything that we do. So I will start off to ask the two police forces if they can take us very quickly, using examples or making it live, as it were, of the process of determining when and where to deploy the technology and how to determine which individuals make up the watch list for watchers.
Thank you, Board Arpal. Good morning, all. We have a very clear focus in terms of the deployment of facial recognition to tackle the most serious crime and the most serious vulnerability. So we have a benchmark at which we determine the necessity and proportionality of the use of the technology. So in answer to your question of a live example, during the summer of this year, we had 3 large-scale events that took place at the Principality Stadium in Cardiff. That's a venue that holds somewhere in the region of 60,000 people. And we used the facial recognition technology to identify people who may be coming to that venue with the intent of committing crime. That could be serious crime such as terrorism. It could be crime against vulnerable people, against young girls and women, such as people who may have intent in relation to violence against some women and girls, and then wider into kind of acquisitive crime, so people who are wanted by the police for having committed crimes, and people who may be involved in acquisitive crime. We apply a serious threshold, and the decision to deploy the equipment is made by an officer of the rank of Assistant Chief Constable or above. So we're talking about a senior officer within the service to make sure that the benchmark for necessity and proportionality has been met.
A senior officer about to take the decision about deployment, and I take it that the stadium, it's because that's where a large number of people will be congregating, so there's a bigger chance of you getting somebody who is on the watch list, and in a live person who takes a decision about matching as well.
So the decision about matching, the decision to deploy is made by a senior officer. That's the authorisation to put the vehicle out on the ground. Yeah. When we deploy on the ground, we have a person who is a specialist in the use of the equipment. We have 20 officers who are trained to use the equipment. It would be different for the Met, obviously. And they determine whether or not a match has been made. That information is passed to an officer, and then the officer will engage with a member of the public in a very calm, very relaxed way, a simple conversation, much as we do as any engagement on the street with a member of the public, and determine whether or not we believe that we have a match for the right individual. To put that in scale, we have deployed our facial recognition system 14 times in the last year, and in that time we have identified a small number of people of interest, and we've had no false positives. So the accuracy of the system for us, it's small in number of deployments, it's small in intrusion, and it's high quality in terms of its accuracy.
Thank you. So do you want to add anything to that?
It might be helpful if it's a slightly different way of deploying in the Met, and if I maybe talk you through what we did on Thursday evening when we deployed in Croydon. The deployment in Croydon was to tackle serious and violent crime. Croydon this year has the highest murder rate, it's got the highest number of knife crime related offences, and it's got a really blossoming nighttime economy, and with that comes problems like violence against women and girls. So that was what we call the intelligence case. That sits behind the reason why we want to deploy that. It's very much linked to that intelligence case. We then go to the watch list. The watch list is pulled together on the back of that intelligence case. And in this particular occasion, on Thursday evening in Croydon, we were looking at crimes such as violence, other serious offences, and people wanted on warrant. That included people wanting for violence against women and girls and for violent robbery. The watch list is pulled together not based on an individual, it's based on those crime types that I just talked about. It's then taken to approval from an authorising officer. In the Met, the authorising officer is superintendent level or above, and that matches other authorisations we have in things like RIPA when it comes to directed surveillance authorisations and things, which is why we set it at that level. And then just, it might be helpful, so everything else, you know, is equal between South Wales and London. How we deploy it is based on authorised police professional practice from the College of Policing. And in terms of results from Thursday night, there were 7 arrests, an individual wanted on suspicion of rape and burglary, someone wanted on recall to prison for robbery, failing to appear for a road traffic offence, criminal damage and possession of Class A drugs, suspicion of fraud and suspicion of drug supply and robbery. So 7 significant offences and people found who were wanted by the police who we wouldn't have otherwise been able to find without that technology.
Was that a specific occasion in Croydon, or just because Croydon is a busy place?
I mean, it's a busy place. We're on the run-up to Christmas. There's a wider policing operation going on in Croydon at the moment, so the policing resource was already deployed there, and this was another tactic in a range of tactics that were being used in Croydon that afternoon and evening.
Thank you. Baroness Chakrabarty.
Thank you. You'll have noted that on Friday a decision came from Brussels that within the EU, police and national security bodies will be banned from using real-time biometric data driven by AI in most circumstances without judicial authorisation. And even in those exceptional circumstances, a very high threshold of specific crime, there will have to be judicial authorisation within 24 hours. Now, I suspect that kind of legal development will have a bearing on, for example, the approach of the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg in due course, and indeed policymakers and legislators here in the UK. But in the meantime, my question is really about the legality of what you're currently doing already. In your previous answers, you talked about we do this and we do that and we set the threshold, but I'm interested in the source in even domestic law for your practice to comply with the Article 8 test of in accordance with the law. Now, the Chair very kindly handed me a schematic and a diagram, slightly contorted diagram from, I think, the MPS website that refers to things like the Human Rights Act, the Equality Act, the Data Protection Act. But of course, these do not create police powers of any kind. They constrain them. So my question really is, what is the source of your democratic and legal justification for experimenting with and operating this kind of intrusive surveillance technology?
So on the Met's website, we've published our legal mandate. The legal mandate takes common law as the primary law, and I think that's the diagram you've got in front of you. Underneath that, there's a complex patchwork of other laws that we pay attention to when we deploy live facial recognition. That's underpinned now by the authorised professional practice from the College of Policing, and we are overseen by a number of bodies and commissioners who ensure that we are acting as we should do according to that professional practice and according to the legal mandate and policy that we've published online on our Met's website.
But just to be clear, there is no specific legislative authority for the deployment of this technology?
No, there isn't, but looking at Bridges and the Bridges appeal judgments, they found that common law was sufficient to be able to deploy that technology, and that's what we're following, and that's what we're building the policy and the legal mandate and the standard operating procedures, which go into more detail about how we deploy. That's what we're building that case on.
Mr. Zik, I want to be neutral about this. I thought you might take the opportunity to refute the term experimenting. And if you would like to, I think you might want to answer that.
So we appreciate in policing that this is an emotive subject. We appreciate that people have very, very different views. I think experimenting is a word, I understand the context of why it's used. The Bridges case was really helpful for policing in the absence of the clarity that you refer to. And it made specific reference in relation to data retention, public awareness, the power to deploy, the gathering of information and the impact on individual members of the public in terms of its use. And it gave clear direction and further direction in relation to the management of equality. That's been very helpful for us to benchmark the way in which we have developed and deployed the equipment, and then for further scrutiny from internal ethics committees, from our commissioner, from the mayor, from London's perspective. So there is significant oversight that is using that benchmark to hold us to account in terms of the deployment of the equipment.
Okay. Thank you. Baroness Shackleton.
Thank you. To the police forces, how did your force reach a decision to procure LFR technology and then decide on the technology developed by NEC? When you're answering that question, please could you include any other providers that you, or how many other providers you considered, and why you came to the conclusion that NEC should be the one that you went with?
So the journey started back in 2017, prior to the Champions League taking place within South Wales, and facial recognition was considered as a preventative measure to provide security to a major international event. A commercial exercise was run, which was led by a mixture of police officers and the procurement team, looking at a set of user requirements or a use case requirement for the procurement of facial recognition. The largest emphasis in terms of the procurement decision was based on the quality of the solution, and the procurement framework was run and delivered, and a preferred provider was selected. I'm not sure of the exact number of people who were considered within that. I think it was it 3, Scott? 4. Apologies. 4 people were considered as part of that process. And then on the basis of the preferred provider meeting the threshold in terms of the procurement framework, the contract was awarded. I think it would be very fair to say that that is the start of an evolution, and whenever you engage with any form of contract or commercial engagement, the product develops as the technology develops, as the intelligence develops, as the use case develops. So it's been a journey that has seen us develop that relationship with our provider, and has also seen the same experience where obviously the Met have moved into this area of policing now as well.
Did you consider the aspect of cybersecurity in relation to this very sensitive information that any procurer has, and how effective that would be in a case where that was deployed against this material?
So we have
did this organisation come up tops in that test?
So we have an internal specification in relation to the security standards of any provider that provides into policing, network security, information security, the ethics of the organisation that we engage with. I would think it would be fair to say that those standards have developed significantly in the last 2 to 3 years as a consequence of hostile state actors and things like that. So that is a constantly changing position. I am not able to say, not because I can't say, I don't know whether it came top in every aspect of the procurement framework. I'd need to take reference in relation to that, but it clearly benchmarked at a level that was satisfactory to meet our requirements.
Very similar from a Met perspective. We also started in 2016, 2017 running trials and proofs of concepts across a number of different suppliers. We looked at 5 in total. Just drawing out some things that my colleague Mark didn't mention, which I think both forces have been involved in when it comes to testing, is the use of NIST, the NIST framework, the National Institute of Science and Technology in the US, which benchmarks different algorithms. And one of the things we looked at when we're looking at those 5 suppliers is where the supply comes on NIST, and NEC at the time was high. I think it's now even higher when it comes to both accuracy and bias. So that was quite important. The other thing we did was some localised operational trials, which we did up in Hendon with a range of different police officers from different backgrounds. The Met being a large force, were able to draw on different people from within. So we did our own tests of the technology. And more recently, I'm sure you're aware of the National Physical Laboratory testing that we did in the operational environment, which used much larger case studies. Similarly, on cybersecurity, yes, a huge interest also, and similar police forces have standards they must meet. The only thing I'd add on that is the system that we use from NEC is a closed system, so we're not plugging in the Met the system into other databases. It's a closed system which feeds itself.
Can I just quickly ask, what percentage of cases, I mean, is it possible to estimate, are wrong? Because I was a bit alarmed that I read recently that there was some large-scale surveillance exercise done in one of the shopping centres in London, and that over half the respondents actually that were said to be captured weren't the right people at all. Now, this may be right, it may be wrong. I mean, this is what I happened to read, but how accurate, in other words, is this technology? What's the percentage where the pictures actually don't match at the end of the day? I mean, maybe I'll ask this about South Wales, since you obviously have done a number of.
So in the last year, we've reviewed 819,943 people. We've had 0 errors.
Right. So the technology, it suggests it's improving. That's all, in a sense, what I'm trying to get at. Is that reasonable to suggest?
That's what our evidence shows.
Yes.
I think we're on our 3rd algorithm update from the provider at the moment, and certainly the number of false alerts has gone right down.
Right.
The Met's not been as successful as South Wales when it comes to false alerts. Over 19 deployments and an awful lot of HACES scanned, if you like, but over 19 deployments, which has resulted in 26 significant arrests. We've had 2 false alerts,
right,
which is well below what the National Physical Laboratory put forward as the rate to expect. That was 1 in 6,000 with the watch list sizes we use. So, you know, it's extraordinarily accurate. But I caution that is one algorithm, and that's the algorithm that we're using at the moment by this provider. So I don't know what your example in the shopping centre is, but it could well be another algorithm, another provider.
Yeah, exactly.
And there is a real mixture of good and bad out there, as you'd expect with any technology.
And you both, I think both, publish figures, is that right? I've certainly seen South Wales.
Yes, we do.
So that's in the public domain.
Yes.
Sorry, Fiona.
How did you gain confidence? Because you've clearly got confidence that NEC's LFR technology works as well, and is it under constant review? And obviously you must have received advice before deciding to use this technology. Where did that advice come from?
So to start with your first question, confidence in technology has obviously grown over time. I think the NIST testing was a starting point. Policing has an ongoing duty for to do what we can in terms of our public sector equality duty. So it's an ongoing thing we have to keep doing. So a one-off NIST test isn't sufficient. We then review after each deployment. We did our own testing. We can continue to review after each deployment. And then earlier this year, we were able to do the National Physical Laboratory testing, which really showed to us not only that the technology was accurate, but how to operate the technology in a fair and equal way. So when it comes to the operating threshold, we know how to operate that technology in a non-biased way. And now, after every deployment, we continue to review what's happened.
The technology, the contracts of this technology, do they come up for review and up for competition standards that other people can pitch for them, or is there a break? How does that work?
It will do. I don't know the details of it to hand.
So
you're not overly dependent on these people forever?
No. I mean, it's what we're using at the moment.
I think one of the benefits of the limited number of police forces that are using facial recognition is that the work between the forces means that our assessment is consistent. We're adopting the same approach between South Wales Police and the Metropolitan Police, which means we can use each other's data as a benchmark and a test, because this is a limited environment. There are not many people that we can ethically compare with. So it's really important that against the College of Policing standards of professional practice and against our own internal ethics committee and direction and oversight, that we are seeking to drive those standards and really push those standards to maintain the ethics of the equipment.
If I come on to who we took advice from, I think both forces took advice from our ethics panels in London. The Mayor's Office of Policing and Crime is linked to London Policing Ethics Panel, and they provided 5 conditions for the ethical deployment of the technology, which we continue to abide by today. We took advice from MOPAC. We took advice from the Information Commissioner's Office. We took advice from the then Biometrics and Surveillance Camera Commissioner. We did speak to IPCO, the Investigatory Powers Commissioner's Office, but because we're not using the technology covertly, we're talking about the overt use of that technology. The IP Act didn't apply in the circumstances, although we did talk to them about the technology. And we're currently talking to the Equality and Human Rights Commission. So a whole range of people are able to provide some advice about the various aspects of how we deploy the technology. And there's ongoing engagement with a range of academics and civil society groups.
Thank you.
I think it would be helpful if you could, after the meeting, let us know the answer to Baroness Shackleton's question about the length of the contracts, how long the contract lasts, what break provisions there might be, and I'm sure there are termination clauses as well before the term expires. I don't know, Mr. Johnson, whether you have a standard contract. Mr. Roberts, I'm sorry, whether you have a standard contract. I suspect not.
It does vary. It varies customer to customer.
Yeah. Yeah. Baroness Prashar.
Thank you, Chair. My question is for Professor Young. Can you hear me? Good. I really want to ask you has there been sufficient research and advice which is readily available to the police forces to enable them to make informed decisions?
Thank you. So if you might allow me to firstly preface my comments by saying, I think what we've heard today is that the police forces are trying very hard to act responsibly in the use of this technology. So my criticisms which are about to come is no criticism of their motivations and their good intentions. But there's a really important question to be asked when we evaluate technology is claimed functional performance of software, which is one question, and whether or not it actually delivers the promised benefit in real world
I'm going to just stop you a second, Professor Young. I'm having difficulty hearing, and I suspect others are as well. I'm just looking at our technical people.
You can speak up a little.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I'll speak unnaturally loudly, and hopefully that will be better. Is that a little bit better?
Yeah, that's much better.
It's being suggested your mic might be a bit too high.
Ah, okay. How's that?
Yes.
Better, yes. Sorry, we just have to keep your voice up. Terrible in this room. They don't help you either.
No, it's fine. So what I want to focus on is the question of operational effectiveness. Will this system, and think about any time you think about buying a new car or a new piece of kit, will it actually deliver the promised benefit in your specific contextual circumstances? So I'm told all sorts of amazing things about what a new piece of kit might do, but what I really need to know is it going to deliver in practice the promised benefits? And this is where we need to keep in mind that there's a world of difference between accurate functional performance of matching software in a laboratory stable setting and then in a real world setting. There's every reason to believe that the technology is getting better in terms of accuracy. I can't deny that the advances in computer science are travelling at a very great pace. However, there's still a massive operational challenge of converting a match alert into a lawful apprehension of a person who is wanted for genuine reasons that match the test of legality. Now, to do that, you have to have police officers on the ground capable of intervening in complex, dynamic settings to lawfully apprehend that person, bearing in mind that the mere fact that an alert has been generated does not in and of itself satisfy the common law test of reasonable suspicion. So when a police officer stops a person in the street, they do so on the basis of voluntary cooperation of that person in producing identification, because the mere fact of a facial recognition alert match is not enough, in my view, to satisfy the reasonable suspicion test. So if we look at the latest data from the 2022 London Met usage throughout the year, we're told 144,000 faces were scanned. That is a prima facie violation of the privacy of 144,000 people in the public settings in London, for which they made 8 arrests, none of which were for serious crimes. Many of them were for small drug offences and shoplifting. So there is a divergence between the claims that they only put pictures of those wanted for serious crimes on the watch list And the fact that in the Oxford Circus deployment alone, there were over 9,700 images on that watch list. I'd quite like to know how each of those 9,700 images were justified as lawful, necessary and proportionate to put those faces on the list. And these are the questions, I think, where the police are not being given enough guidance, because the law is actually very difficult to apply. You actually do need human rights expertise to apply it meaningfully. And the police are really going to struggle in making those lawful and proportionate decisions in specific contexts. So I don't think there is enough guidance. I don't think it's clear enough. And I think we do need a legislative framework that makes that much more straightforward.
Thank you for that. A lot of questions arising. We're given the time, I won't pursue them.
Well, I don't know. I think that our witnesses might like to respond to that.
So thank you. So I'm a what's called a Gold Public Order Commander. I manage large-scale events. And one of the things that I try to do is to achieve layers of prevention, layers of things to deter people coming to a location that might want to cause harm to other people. We've both explained how we use the equipment slightly differently between the two forces, but we for example, are using the equipment at a large event with a large number of people where we're trying to create a safe environment. And, you know, I can give you examples of people arrested for robbery, for gang crime, for very serious offences that do meet the threshold of a serious offence as defined in law. It's inevitable that when people are wanted for offences that they will become involved in this type of operation. It doesn't mean that they're not justified to be engaged with. It's very, very clear that an image identified through facial recognition does not meet a threshold to arrest an individual. What we do is we stop and engage with a member of the public like we do every day of the year when we stop a motorist and speak to a motorist, or when we stop a member of the public, we stop, we talk to them, we try to identify whether or not they pose a risk to themselves, they might be a missing person, whether they pose a risk to somebody else, they might be a paedophile, or whether they're engaged in criminality. I am personally of the view that the preventative and the operational benefits of the system do add value, save money and keep people safe. I would also agree that it's a complex area of law and that the application of this requires significant thought and proportionate use, which is why our deployment principles and the benchmark for deployment are set as high as they are in terms of authorisation and are as limited as they are in terms of the number of deployments.
You said earlier that your choice, you gave the examples of the stadium, the choice of venue was because of the numbers of people. Is that not slightly at odds with the point you've just made about seeking to be using the systems to find people who pose a danger to the public? I thought you said in that situation, but I might have read that in my own head.
To be clear, if we were at a pop concert where there'd be young people there, we would be very concerned about people coming to that concert who may have an intent towards young people. So we would use that in a bid to prevent people coming in the first instance, to stop them coming because of the preventative measure. If they do come, to identify them so we can engage with them and to make sure that people are safe. So the issue of vulnerability, we have issues like terrorism, which people would think about and very much here, aren't they? They're evident for you every day in terms of your security at this site. But there's vulnerability that we're also using this equipment for, missing people, young girls who are vulnerable, people who pose a risk to society that we otherwise wouldn't be able to find. And it's a very important part of our public safety strategy for major events.
If I can just respond to Professor Young on a couple of specific points, and then I just want to talk through a little bit more broadly about what an officer does when the match comes in. But the specific points, the scanning of the faces that Professor Young talks about, I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page here and understands that this is fleeting, instantaneous, it's not kept. If you're not a match, your image is immediately and automatically destroyed. In the back of the van, the people watching those images coming past will see that it's pixelated, so they can't even see the faces coming towards them. The watch lists in London are large. There's a lot of wanted offenders in London that we're trying to find. Some will be local subsets. So if, for example, take the example that Professor Young referred to, I think it was Oxford Street, In the Oxford Street example, some of the local subsets will be shoplifters, prolific shoplifting offenders who we've seen in the media the shops are desperate to catch. There will also be some broader categories of murderers, rapists, and those who fit into the really serious crime categories. Just talking through how the technology works. If I'm an officer, I look for people every day. In a morning briefing, I might stand up and be shown pictures of 100 wanted people that we're trying to look for. There's no way as an officer I could remember those individual faces. All this technology does is up the chances of plucking that face out of a crowd. What comes after that, at that point, is normal policing, normal officer powers. So all the officer will get is an alert. We train them every time we deploy what to look out for. They'll look at this alert and then they'll make their own decision. Does that face look like the face of the wanted person? That's the human in the loop. That I'm sure you've heard us talk about it before. That's the human in the loop, making the human decision. And then officer policing, normal policing kicks in. They'll go and, as my colleague Mark was saying, they'll engage. They'll ask the person to identify themselves. If they are a wanted offender, that may lead to arrest.
So the distinction between the use of LFR and what you say is called normal policing is at that first stage. Does the scale of this go to proportionality and necessity?
When you say the scale of this...
Well, the scale the scale of any given operation, because by definition it's bigger than couple of officers who happen to be crossing Oxford Circus.
Yeah, okay, so faces scanned, there's a lot of wanted people in London. I think there's a balance here, isn't there, between security and privacy. For me, I think it's absolutely fair, and the majority of the public, when we look at public surveys, we're seeing between 60 and 80% of the public here are actually supportive of law enforcement using the technology. I think that balance is right. I am quite happy for a fleeting, instantaneous glimpse of my face, which is immediately destroyed if I'm not on the watch list. I'm content for that to take place. Others may feel different. The majority of the public in the surveys that they've been over the past 3 years are supportive, though. And then I'm not sure if you were talking about the number of officers involved in the deployment, that they're quite small.
Okay, Baroness Chakrabarty, and then I'll go to Lord Blunkett.
I'm interested in protesters who aren't actually wanted for a criminal offence. I understand that South Wales has been lending technology to other forces, and in particular, you lent your kit to Northamptonshire for the Silverstone Formula One weekend, where the Chief Constable there said he was looking for protesters, and of the 790 names on his watch list, only 234 were wanted for arrest, which leaves 556 on a watch list who were not wanted for arrest for any crimes. So I'm just concerned about these people who are on the watch list, who are potentially protesters or others. You talked about victims and some others who are not actually wanted for any crime.
So I know the scenario that you're talking about. I was the person that actually authorised the deployment of the equipment to come out to South Wales. Be very honest with you, the way that it works is we authorise the deployment of the equipment to another force. The force that it goes to then works through its own policy and procedure to determine what it has sitting on its watch list. And the reason for that is they understand their local threats. We've talked about the differences in the threats between the Metropolitan Police and the South Wales Police. So the local force makes a determination in relation to the necessity and the proportionality of the use of the equipment. And in the scenario that you're talking about, the specific issue related to a stated intent or a believed intent that people would try and access an environment that would put their lives at risk or put the lives of other people at risk. And on that basis, that's why the force made the decision that it made. That is their decision to account for the use of that technology, and it's their authority in terms of the actual deployment of that equipment. I can tell you that from the South Wales perspective, that we have not used the equipment for protest, and we don't intend to use the equipment for protest as a routine matter. We don't see the necessity of that. There are far better technologies for gathering intelligence in relation to protest from our perspective than facial recognition. I don't rule that out in the future. on the basis that if there was a stated intent to cause a threat to the life of another, that we would consider the use of the equipment. The watch list in that scenario for ourselves would be so narrow, it would be constrained to those people who we believed had that stated intent. We do not use this for general protest activity, and it is not within the Chief Constable's direction as to how we will use it in the future.
That's very helpful. Thank you. So that's very frank and very helpful in the patchwork of totally differential criteria that are being adopted around the country by different police forces. Thank you.
And I'm sorry, Baroness Pritchard, you were very self-disciplined. We took advantage of that, I did. Lord Blunkett.
Yes, I'm not against the use of technology, but clearly we're talking here, as we have so far, about proportionality, about the ethics, about the practical nature. I wonder if you could say a word or two. I'm really referring to South Wales and the Met, but I think that both a manufacturer, Paul, and Professor Young might actually also have an interest in this. In terms of training, how many people at what level is in South Wales and the Met are actually being trained, not just with the practicality of the use of it, but of these broader issues which Lindsay, you referred to in terms of the ICO and the EHRC and the nature of what we're talking about, not just at the approval level, whether it's DCC or superintendent level, but actually those operating and being responsible for how far they go at very local level.
Okay. So we have 7 officers who are trained in relation to the mobile units that we deploy. This is extensive training on facial matching, and they always deploy with the van on every deployment. And then separately from that, when a deployment takes place, all of the officers who are going to be out on the street, so the officers who are going to be making those interventions, having those engagement sessions, talking, potentially arresting someone, they always have a training input immediately prior to the deployment. This happens every time, even if they've been trained already and it happened 2 weeks ago. We want to give them the most up-to-date knowledge and training and explain actually the watch list based on the intelligence case for that specific deployment. The training covers things like how the system works, what happens to the public data when there's a match and the fact it's destroyed, so those privacy by design features I've already mentioned. We talk a lot about the human in the loop and that it's not the technology making the decision. We talk about the testing we've done, so the performance of the system, the accuracy of the system, including how we operate it to ensure it's fair and equitable so that there's no bias. And then we talk also about unconscious bias, because while the system we know how to operate in a non-biased way, of course the human operator who then takes the steps after the system has created the match also needs to be aware of their unconscious bias.
And who's doing the training?
One of the LFR team who've also been through the significant additional training on how the system works.
And who has trained the trainer?
Is that NEC?
It is, yeah. So as NEC, as with all customers, we carry out 2 types of training. So operational training and more technical training. As is really common practice with suppliers of software to UK policing, we work on a train the trainer or master trainer model where we educate a number of people within the organisation. They then take that specific product knowledge that we give them, wrap it around with all of the process and other issues that form part of the role of the person and deliver that as a customised course locally, reflecting local force policies.
I asked the question in the way I did because it's clear from the answers that we've already received that there is a real fragmentation across the country in terms of how people might perceive using the technology and therefore the coherence and consistency of training between different force areas, including where you're reaching out, as the Northamptonshire example was given by Baroness Chakrabarti. There is a fragmentation of training anyway, which I think has been made worse by the previous Home Secretary. So I'm really interested in where the external element of the training is coming from.
So One of my roles, I'm the Director of Intelligence in the Met and the SRO for the Met Police use of this technology, but I'm also the National Police Chiefs Council National Lead for Facial Recognition. And what we do through that national leadership role that I've got is we run a strategic board and bi-monthly working groups where what we're doing moving forward as more forces gain an interest in that technology is pool our advice. I mean, it's very much a joint board with South Wales Police where we bring our advice, our training, how to work through things like impact assessments, and how we went about procuring and testing the technology. So I think you're right, and we've recognised that previously as being a bit of a gap. And over the past 12 months or so, we've really worked at bringing this national board together so that we can offer as a font of knowledge for other forces who are interested in moving forwards with the technology.
You're giving, sorry about this, Chair, but you're giving them advice. That's not the same thing as training.
At the moment, there aren't other forces, with the exception of the one South Wales are working for, there aren't other forces using the technology.
I think to give you some confidence about consistency, accepting that you may want to challenge the way in which the training is constructed, that the deployments that have taken place so far in terms of the use of the equipment on the ground have taken place between two forces, which have been the Metropolitan Police and South Wales Police. If we provide equipment to another force area, our trained staff go with that equipment to make sure that the application and the use of the equipment is consistent wherever it is deployed. So for want of a better phrase, in the example that I was asked about in relation to the Grand Prix, South Wales Police went and operated the equipment. However, they are operating the equipment with the watch list that's provided by the Home Force. So we're using our equipment with their intelligence. So what that does mean, Lord Blunkett, is consistency in terms of the application of training and use between the two forces.
And finally, I may just want a one-word answer, because this is a leading question. As this technology is rolled out and many more forces are using it, isn't there a need for both a national training programme and a standard that all can adhere to?
I think there is a standard through the introduction of the authorised professional practice at the College of Policing. I think I take away your comments on training, and as more forces come on board, it's very much an ambition we'd like to do. We're not quite there yet because, as my colleague was saying, it's really only South Wales Police and the Met who've got access to the technology. But moving forwards, I think it's a really good idea, which we will work on.
I think we welcome agile guidance that can move at the pace that technology and criminality moves.
We've talked about Northamptonshire, and I've seen somewhere that Essex Police are using or going to be using the technology.
That's correct. So Essex Police have had again a mutual aid operation where we provide the equipment to them, and they ran an operation in relation to threats around the nighttime economy, and they made, I believe, 2 arrests as part of that operation, and they were for people who were wanted for offences that were more serious than kind of sort of the shoplifting analogy that's been given previously.
You've talked in terms of training on the technology. We're starting, as you obviously have to start, a step or two back from that. All the rights and privacy legislation that the country should be working under. So training in that and alertness to that and advice available to officers who are making decisions. I was on a committee which went to an Air Force base where we were actually talked through procedures about decisions being made to use drones, armed drones in the Middle East, and having a lawyer available at the time of every operation. Have you got an equivalent?
I mean, from a Met perspective, all officers in the Met are obliged to do a College of Policing training, which is called, I think it's called Information Anew, which takes you through your data protection obligations as a police officer. So and that's one example of a number of other standard packages of training that all police officers must do. And then when it comes to individual specific deployments, we do take legal advice as part of our regular catch up when we're going to deploy this technology. I think we recognise the fact that it is still new, it's still innovative, we're still building on our experience each time, and that legal advice is really important.
So a similar situation, all of the people who can authorise deployment have been trained either as public order or firearms commanders, so they're familiar with the balance of Article 2, 8, 10, 11 and 12. As part of our operational training for our staff, we focus our activity around the legislative use on a small group of people so that we are focused in how we apply it. The decisions that the officers have to make on the ground are theirs. We don't direct, it's their decision to make on the basis of necessity and proportionality. Traditional and good policing skills, courtesy, patience, tolerance, understanding are the things that help them get through and work out whether or not we need to make a decision. But I would come back to the observation in terms of volumes. We're talking about arresting 5 people in 2023 and identifying 10 people of concern in 2023 in total. So this is not an everyday tactic with everyday use and everyday consequences.
I'll go to Baroness Meacher.
I think my question's largely been asked, but maybe we can go on a quick question to Paul Roberts about explainability. How is explainability, by which you mean the ability to explain how a certain outcome was reached, embedded into the LFR technology, if it is?
Okay. I think as background, we have many systems that involve different forms of AI. Face recognition we've been doing for a long time. So we started our journey with that back in 1989. In terms of our design principles, we very much, I think Lindsay used the phrase human in the loop. So we very much embody the human in the loop and ensure that where we're providing an alert or a notification, we're really drawing someone's attention to look at something. We're not providing a direct call to action or a direct instruction. So no decision's been made. We're simply bringing something to someone's attention. But the way we do that in an LFR use case is through an alert, and that alert being a member of the public has passed through the zone of recognition with an LFR system, and their face bears a high degree of similarity to that of someone on one of the watch lists. So similarity is our measure really of explainability, and that's a score. It's a variable score. We have our threshold, which I think Lindsay's mentioned in terms of having been informed by the National Physical Laboratory testing in terms of validating no bias. So there's a level where we're not generating lots of false alarms. There's a level where we're still generating alarms where serious offenders are going past and being recognised. So we provide these alarms or alerts only at this threshold when it's met. When we provide that, there's really 2 classes of officer that we provide information to. The first is within the van, so they have a larger screen. We display larger images of the face captured by the camera. So the best, bear in mind people are walking past the camera, lighting changes, angles change, all of these technical challenges. So we get the best face we can from what we've seen in the camera. We get the face from the watch list, and we provide them for human comparison between the two. We augment that with our similarity score. So from the similarity score, the officer knows, is this something just above the threshold, which is a maybe, or is it something really clear that the computer really thinks with confidence this is a strong similarity. And we display other information like the watch list and whatever things force is put to the officer outside the vehicle. So the engagement officer who may carry out the engagement with the public, they have all the same information, just in a smaller form factor. So it's on a smartphone type device, so they can still see the faces and still have the similarity score as a mechanism of understanding it. So that's, in face recognition, similarity scores kind of accepted as the explainability basis for it.
Really interesting. Thank you very much. And what information does the interface provide to empower operators to interpret and challenge the results provided? Do you feel you prepare them to do that?
So I think it's, human comparison is effectively the main element of that. In other face recognition systems, so perhaps we're looking at things after an incident has happened, we provide lots of tools to kind of measure feature lengths and all these things. There isn't really the time for that during a live facial recognition deployment. So the time period between a person passing the camera and then disappearing into the crowd is quite narrow. So in engaging with our customers, there isn't really a time window to provide any more tooling than that human comparison. Okay.
Thanks very much. That's fine.
I have to say, I think the phrase human in the loop has passed its usefulness because it has become a bit of a mantra. One can deploy it, as was deployed by Home Secretary to this committee without, I think, any detail of what is actually meant by that. That's personal and self-indulgent. Professor Young, do you want to comment on the training provisions?
Yes, thank you. So I think one of the real challenges here is not necessarily in the match that is produced by the software, but there is a need, I think, as Baroness Chakrabarty has pointed out, for training in the legal requirements for populating a watch list. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I don't know the answer to is when an alert is generated, and given the myriad categories of people that the evidence suggests that the kinds of justifications used to put someone's face in the watch list, there's all the difference in the world between someone who is wanted on a warrant for a serious crime and a person who's been identified as missing or vulnerable. Is an officer told the reasons why that person's face has been placed on the watch list? And what is the explainability and justification for that specific face being on the watch list? I would really like to know the answer to that question, and I haven't been able to find it. So I'm not sure what training is provided on that very, very important piece.
Right, let's see if we can hear.
I'm happy to. So if the question is how do we determine what's on the watch list in terms of category type, so you give me the example of missing persons, vulnerable persons, we set a criteria within the organisation that is agreed at a senior officer level for each event, and then those categories would be drawn from our systems by classification to populate the watch list. So what you haven't got is an individual officer looking at each individual person to say it's this person, it's that person. We are looking at groups of people by category that we can be confident in terms of the nature of the reason they've been brought onto the list. So, for example, a missing person, a high-risk missing person by age or by vulnerability is something we can classify readily, and we draw that down because of our belief in relation to necessity and proportionality to bring that group of people into the watch list. It would be the same in relation to issues like counter-terrorism suspects or people that have got a history of sexual offending. We would use that group of people and that would be drawn together. The watch list would be considered for each deployment and to make sure that the categories were perceived to be necessary, but it's not at an individual identification for a person for each deployment.
It's absolutely the same in the Met. The only thing I will add to what Mark has just said is that there's quite a lot of information on the Met's and South Wales Police's websites around watchlist categories. So there's information available there for the public to see.
Professor Young.
Yeah, so there seems to be a bit of a mismatch between claims that the watch list is only populated by those who are wanted for serious crimes. So that's the official statement that the Met Police have put out. And now we're being told that, in fact, the category of people is more variable. The thing that troubles me the most is that in a liberal democratic society, it's essential that the coercive power of the state is used to justify every single decision about an individual. And the fact that we're categorising people, but we're not actually evaluating each specific person, troubles me deeply.
So, yeah, I don't recall what particular statement that was, but I think I can explain it in terms of layering. So before we deploy the technology, we engage locally with the community. We engage with local shops, local businesses, retail, or wherever it is we're going to deploy it. So serious for them is probably quite different to serious from another scenario. So I think we can all accept serious crimes like rape, robbery, armed robbery, murder. They're serious crimes. But actually, if you're a retailer on Oxford Street and you're suffering from prolific shoplifting and threatening behaviour to your shop staff, that is also a serious criminality. So it very much depends, in consultation with the local community and retail partners, what the makeup of that watch list might be, and it may change according to where we're operating. And the watch list is destroyed after the operation, and a new watch list will be created for the next operation, dependent on the intelligence case.
I'm not seeking, I'll quite happily take the challenge in relation to police trying to justify its position. I can speak from my position as a public order, public safety commander. I will take a balanced view as to the impact or collateral intrusion we have on members of the public who come to an event where we have to keep them safe. And I look at the tragic circumstances of events like Manchester and other events where people have experienced horrendous injury as a consequence of individual people, a single person carrying out a criminal act. And what I'm trying to do is create a lawful, necessary and proportionate position of people being concerned that if they come to that event with criminal hostility, criminal intent or hostility, that we will try and identify them and disrupt their activity. That's really, really clear for me. Now, we can't put the ring of steel that is around this building around our society. We wouldn't want that. It would be too intrusive. But what we do have to do is create an environment where people can come, mums and dads can come with their kids and feel they're going to be safe when they go and watch a concert. And that's a really difficult balance for us to strike in terms of how we keep the public safe with the least intrusive measures.
Let's continue on the public's perception of this. Baroness Sanderson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for coming today. This is another question for the police forces, and as we've said, it's sensitive, it's controversial technology, so the more that we can understand it, I think. Thank you. And to that end, you've touched on this, Lindsay, but we'd be interested to know what methods you use to communicate with the public about the use of the technology, how much information about the use you share with members of the public, and is the information easy for them to find? I think for me as well, there's something. There's something as well about, as Professor Young says, about the population of a watch list, because you say that broadly the public is in support of the technology, and I understand that if that's a national general survey. But I live in Brixton, where the community is already quite scarred by stop and search, and I'm just quite interested in how this technology in areas where you may be deploying this technology, such as Croydon, what the sort of community impact is on that, and how you sort of, what measures are in place to try and overcome that, because
you're absolutely right. And if I refer to a Mayor's Office and Policing and Crime survey we have, what we find is that as a broad catch, yes, the public's in support of law enforcement use of LFR. When you drill down into specific community groups, that support does start to drop. Yeah. And that's something we're really interested in and have been doing quite a lot of work on. There's loads of information out there on our website. However, I accept that the website is probably a little bit difficult to read, and we need to do better on communications and find different ways of engaging with people. As part of that, we meet with various groups, independent advisory groups. We've been doing some work with young people, with different local community groups. And before every deployment, if we were going to deploy in Brixton, we haven't to date, but if we were, and we did this with Croydon, we'd be engaging with the local community through the BCU to actually understand how they feel about the technology. Quite often what happens in that scenario is the level of knowledge is quite low. So when we arrive, there's a lot of reticence, there's a lot of negativity about it. And by the end of a session where we've been able to explain what we do, but probably most importantly what we don't do, and how we've managed to do the work on, particularly on equality actually, minds change and people become supportive. So the communications is a massive piece, and I feel there's more work to be done on that.
And sorry, just to make the reference back to stop and search again, so Wendy Williams in her HMIC report suggested that there should be scrutiny panels because it is difficult. It's a difficult power to use. So would you consider something like that in the use of this technology? So I mean, I guess there's different layers, isn't there? We've got here, which you've already mentioned, how you tell the public if they've been identified as a match, and then sort of human policing kicks in, as it were. But if you've misidentified somebody, how do you stop them? It's the wrong person, they shouldn't have been on the watch list. I'm a bit unclear about what happens in the cases where somebody's on a watch list and maybe shouldn't have been, and there's no reason for them to be, and how that works in terms of trust in the police.
It depends on the individual interaction, doesn't it? And, officers are trained, as my colleague was saying, to act with empathy, to act with the right sort of friendly interaction. And if officers do make stops, and sometimes they stop the wrong person, if that does happen, then we'll find out through identification measures whether that's a fingerprint or another check. And if they're not wanted and they're not on the watch list, they'll be allowed to go. And the training is that entire interaction should be commonplace in policing, along with sort of a good level of engagement and empathy.
And forgive me, because I should probably know this, but are the figures for that then publicly available?
Yes.
Is it all publicly available?
Yeah, for every deployment that the Met in South Wales does, we publish everything.
And would you consider the scrutiny panels in a similar way as for stop and search? Because obviously you put stuff on the website, but people don't look at the website necessarily.
I wouldn't rule it out. I think oversight is really important, and I want the oversight. I want to be overseen by a body with teeth so I can prove and demonstrate how I'm operating. There's lots of oversight that I ran through a little bit earlier, the various bodies and things.
Yeah, it's more the public.
So yes, oversight, really, really important. And yes, if that's another way of doing it, potentially, I guess the question for me would be possibly, can we streamline it and sort of focus on the right questions?
Yeah.
So I think it's very, very fair to challenge that there'll be members of the community who don't trust policing. Our independent ethics committee and the oversight of police and crime commissioners and mayors, I think, are really important in terms of representing the voice of people who don't want to necessarily engage with us because they don't trust us. I think that's really important. In terms of that, we do have oversight in relation to stop and search, in particular where use of force is used, or contentious stop and search, where we use members of the public to do independent advisory group scrutiny in terms of what we do. And I think your question provokes the consideration around the equivalent of the ride-along scheme that we have with stop and search actually coming into the facial recognition world. You know, the principle, I think, travels very in a very, very sort of similar scenario where members of the community could actually come and see, watch, observe, experience, and then potentially guide and support in relation to how we do it. I think it's very worth us considering how we could bring more of that into this area. Definitely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I just remind our witnesses to speak into the mics? We have to deal with the acoustics of the room and the broadcasting and the recording as well. I'm sorry.
No, thank you. Thank you very much.
Right, then move on to Lord Filkin, who is on the screen. But muted. I think you might have turned yourself off again.
A question first, if I could, to the two police forces, again about transparency. Could you confirm that you have completed the algorithmic transparency recording standard collection for your use of LFR?
So in relation to where we are at the moment, in relation to this, there are 6 criteria that are set. The documentation that we hold exceeds those criteria. We've engaged from the perspective of do we meet that or not, and we're satisfied that we go beyond that. So we meet that standard and further and beyond.
I'd echo
Sorry,
that.
I may be being thick. I didn't understand whether that was a yes or a no.
We've assessed our use of facial recognition against the 6 criteria that's set within that standard. We have met that criteria and we exceed that criteria.
Does that mean you've made a judgment that you do not need to register?
We've engaged with the body that have that oversight, and their view is that we've met that criteria. We haven't registered at the moment.
I think there's another
I think I've got
question.
his invention.
There's another question in here, which is about actually registering, which comes before the meeting the criteria.
Okay, so
that's what I was on about, yeah. I heard the last sentence you said, you have not registered. Is that correct?
Correct, yes.
And that's correct.
We haven't registered either, but as my colleague was saying, looking at what's required, we meet those requirements. And I'm very happy to go away and register on it. I think moving forwards, I think both forces meet the requirements. We've not registered. We can do going forward.
I don't think any of us is claiming that registration on websites is the be all and end all. But there's an incongruity between what you said in terms of a commitment to transparency in the public domain and the fact that you've not registered.
And also, if I could add to that while you're thinking about the answer, the government has made quite a considerable point to us about the possibility of registering and expecting registration when we've asked questions about public understanding and knowledge of what is going on in our society, if I put it very broadly, when we have talked about regulation and asked why the systems, the AI systems, are not regulated.
So, we're happy to register, and we will also consider, it's our decision around professional practice is not our decision. We will make a recommendation that the registration is included within professional practice. We can't make that decision.
As the professional lead, Ms. Chiswick, you could take that back. I'm thinking back to the evidence that we had a couple of years ago, and I know life has moved on a little, but it's not moved on to regulation, so I think we'd still hear the same point being made.
So I'll commit to take that away to the National Strategic Board, which actually sits this Thursday, so it's perfect timing, and we will move forward with that, and as my colleague says, get it attached to the authorised professional practice so people know there's an expectation to fill it out.
Chair, since you've asked my question for me so well, can I just deal with a wider question briefly? It's obvious that technology is significantly faster than regulation does. My question is essentially about what is probably to Professor Karen Young. What is coming down the line next that policymakers and regulators should be thinking about? Otherwise, we'll be well behind the game. Let me give you an example just to try to make my point. If I've understood it correctly, LFS is essentially site-specific at this point in time. I would expect that the technology made it perfectly possible to connect multiple cameras into a very large database, and therefore, for example, to search across London almost simultaneously for suspects. Karen, do you think that is possible or will be possible soon? And what does it then imply in terms of the need of regulation and legality?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think technically it's already possible insofar as the camera infrastructure is already in place and you just need a very high quality internet connection to do so. This is where the analogy between I only saw you naked very briefly doesn't work, because what we're talking about, and the former biometrics commissioner said this, is we are moving from the equivalent of line fishing to deep ocean trawling. This is surveillance at scale remotely that is possible across an entire nation in real time. I have a former researcher who is from China. He says that you cannot walk anywhere in public or even into a shop without being identified as a specific individual. So it's a very powerful technology. The capacity to scale up is readily malleable once the infrastructure is in place. You can see the attractions for control within that. Infrastructure, and that's why I think we need to use it.
Chair, could I just finish the questioning? That's exactly what I feared would be the answer. Clearly, there could be theoretical benefits to that. Could I get the response to the two police forces to that as to what they think is required in terms of an effective system of transparency and state regulation of that? Because this is going to be with us within a year or so, obviously, in terms of what's possible.
So, I don't mind. I think yes, all of this is possible, and more probably. But while there's this dystopian kind of quite frightening future, if I bring us back to the here and now, we need to go back to the law and how it operates and how we work on necessity and proportionality. And that's really, really important. That's the thing that we're going to keep coming back to. So it's the necessity and proportionality to be operating in that area at that time with an intelligence case behind it, and the means of policing to respond. So if you take the example, I think Professor Young was talking about using all of our existing cameras, but just bear in mind they're quite high, so the angle's not going to be quite right to catch a face. But even if it was, and even if we could do all of that, there's a necessity and proportionality of doing that, but also you'd need an officer on hand to actually react and respond to that match. So it just simply doesn't work as a setup. But if we come back to the law, and underpinning the law, the authorised professional practice, and then underpinning our activities as policing, the oversight that we've already talked about and the importance of that.
That's very optimistic. Well, let me not interrupt. Let me hear from South Wales first.
I think that one of the things that in the case we've articulated to you that is a benefit is that the public can see that facial recognition operations are in progress, because they are very aware. There is signage. There is a big white van. The van has signage on it saying what it is. We engage on our website. We tell people. I think if policing is to move to a position where it is not overt for the public, that is a position in which I think we need to think very seriously about our relationship with the public in terms of transparency and what that might mean. It's a big step to go from facial recognition mobilised in a vehicle to facial recognition mobilised on an infrastructure. That doesn't necessarily mean that might not be the right thing to do, or might not be the right thing to do for particular events. But there would need to be, I think, clear direction about how that should be delivered through really tight professional practice to make sure that it was governed and managed in an appropriate way. The difference with what we were talking about there as well, on the back of the point that Lindsay made before, the moment facial recognition is a closed system, the minute you start to integrate that into camera systems, then you start to look at network solutions, and that becomes more challenging. So there will be wider considerations beyond the moral and civil liberties issues into information security and how that would manage. It becomes infinitely more complex.
Thank you. And yes, indeed, and let me close really by saying I think what you have said and what we've opened there raises a pretty big issue that requires significant parliamentary scrutiny and consideration. I think the few words that was said by Lindsay at the end, and more, is also important. We need to have sight of what looks as if it's coming rather than just be reacting to what happened 2 years or so ago. And we need to open up the extremely difficult balance of crime and security enforcement against civil liberties that this poses. This is not a job. This is not a job that individual police forces can do, and so it requires a wider process. Thank you, though, for that input.
Okay, thank you. I need to keep moving. So, Lord McInnes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you. Excuse me, this cough. My question's to Professor Young, and clearly, transparency of algorithms is something that's a hot topic in many ways of life at the moment, not least LFR. And I'd be interested in your view as to how the competing concerns of public safety and also commercial sensitivity for suppliers for algorithms can be balanced against the public transparency needs of people understanding the algorithms behind LFR when put into practice.
Great. Thank you for your question. So if I can start with the public transparency issue first, I think we need to think about this in terms of community transparency for the way in which the system is used and administered, and to have confidence that it's being administered in accordance with legal requirements. And then there's local explainability or contestability for an individual who is dragged into the net of being asked to respond to an alert, for example, or any other application from the use of biometrics. In terms of the global transparency, there is a legitimate concern that if there is too much transparency, the system might be gamed, so that persons who are genuinely of interest because they are wanted for a serious crime might then avoid the area. So there is a legitimate concern about gaming prior to the deployment in a specific context, but that doesn't affect the need for ex-post transparency and accountability. So I don't really see why there can't be very public information that justifies a use in a particular case with a very clear statement of the categories, the number of people whose faces were on there and why. So I think there's still a possibility for having meaningful transparency ex-post that gets around the genuine gaming concern. And so I think that one can be handled in that way. I still have concerns concerns about local justifications and the appropriateness of explaining to a person why their face was on that watch list. I'm still troubled by that. I don't feel entirely satisfied. In terms of the commercial confidentiality, there is a tension between the legitimate interests in commercial software producers like NEC wanting to keep secret the inner workings, if you like, of the algorithmic system. And we know that in the Bridges case, there was no exposure of the underlying training data sets to evaluate the equality implications of that software. From my own view, I think the way that can be resolved is using the general approach of covert security, where you have an independent agency that scrutinizes without making that public, that has integrity, so that there can actually be evaluation and testing under the hood, which doesn't infringe on commercial confidentiality. So I think there is a way of mediating those tensions through appropriate institutional safeguards and settings, but they're not currently in place.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Could I just follow up very quickly with that and ask our three panellists here in the room if, in principle, they would have an issue with some independent body having full access to transparency after the fact of any LFR programme. Paul, maybe begin with you.
I think from a supplier point of view, it's I guess the nearest analogy is the Colonel's secret blend of herbs and spices in terms of KFC and things. And we invest vast sums of money in getting our algorithm to the point of the highest accuracy and the no bias. And training data is absolutely fundamental to that in terms of the mix of images that we legitimately source and utilise it in building our models. So I think that inherently, organisationally, we have a nervousness around that position. I'm happy to take it away and discuss internally the option Karen's kind of presented there around independent scrutiny. We certainly understand that the tension between the two. I was the witness in South Wales versus Bridges. So I was able to do certain things, for example, to satisfy myself with, so our algorithms produced in Japan, in our laboratories in Japan. I was able to access certain amounts of data that allowed me to say under oath that I understood there were representative data sets that seemed appropriate to the needs. So I think that it's not quite an independent one, but it's a level of access that wouldn't normally be there. So I'm happy to take that away and look at how we might be able to come up with a solution for that.
And Lindsay and Mark, do you think there's a way forward?
I think we did what we could, given that what Paul has said, to meet our public sector equality duty through the independent testing we did with the National Physical Laboratory.
Okay.
I don't have an objection to oversight and scrutiny as long, or support and guidance, as long as it's well informed and it's cohesive with the other guidance and scrutiny being given. So we're working to a framework that actually is clear in its direction, is not at odds with each other or not in conflict. If we're going to take advice and guidance, it's got to be consistent so we can actually work with it and understand it and use it.
I think that's very helpful. Thank you, Jim.
Could I just add one small point to that, which is often the focus of these things often is on the input into the model. And actually, in many cases, it's the output. It's very hard to assess the input into a model. It's really the output from the model, which is what the NPL tests and the NIST tests, for example, do. That hopefully gives people confidence in the range of scenarios that the accuracy is maintained across genders and races and all of those kind of different attributes. So I think, happy to look at the input part of the model, but the output part is very public already.
Thank you.
Oversight, scrutiny and accountability. Lord Beath.
What do we know about the frequency or number of cases taken to police and complaints commissioners or the deputy mayor? Have we got some experience of that?
I'm not aware of any formal complaints for the Met's use of the technology. I run a strategic board in the Met once a month, and on that board sits a member of MOPAC. That's where we review each deployment, and then we do sort of larger reviews from time to time. I know there are some boroughs who don't want to use it, who have talked about not wanting to be part of that, and they're boroughs that I'd really like to engage with, if we're not already, to talk them through the technology and how it works, coming back to the point earlier about sort of levels of understanding. But I'm not actually aware of any formal complaints to MOPAC.
I'm thinking of the person who didn't want to spend his afternoon being engaged with by police officers, but hoped to watch the football match or attend the January sales, and doesn't want to be identified to those around him as someone the police are interested in.
So we advertise on our website through the PCC's, Police and Crime Commission's website, and on our vehicles how people can access and engage if they want to make a complaint. I would say we're almost inviting it, if I can be quite honest, in terms of how we're presenting that information to the public. We haven't had a single complaint. Some people might say, well, that's because people don't trust your complaint system, and that is a fair observation. There are people who don't trust our complaint system. I think the route and the opportunity is there, which is why I personally think we need to go away and explore the proposal in relation to the oversight, visibility, ride-along type approach that was talked about previously, where independent members of the community can observe and see what's going on. We haven't had anybody, when we're talking about engaging somebody, if that person is not the person we're looking for, and bear in mind we're talking about literally a couple of false positives across the two forces, none in South Wales, we're not taking their time in an unnecessary manner. When we engage with people, it's generally quite a quick interaction, and if it's not a threat to that event, they will be able to go on their way. If they're wanted on warrant or they're going to be arrested, then they won't get to the football match, they go into custody. But ultimately we would say that was necessary and proportionate. The intrusion from this is in time is very limited, and it wouldn't stop people who are legitimately going around their business getting to that event.
And on one wider question, what protection do we have against a hostile state acquiring access to this system, these systems, and using it in their pursuit of dissidents, for example?
We talked earlier a little bit, didn't we, about the cyber protection and it being operated to a standard across policing to ensure that it's safe. The system's a closed system, so it's not linked to other policing networks, which helps as well. It makes that level of security easier to complete. And the system itself, the watch list is created for the intelligence case. It's uploaded onto the system 24 hours before, and then immediately after it's deleted because we don't need it anymore. There's no policing purpose to retain it. So, and throughout the time it's on the system, there are levels of authority about who has access to it. So I think it would be quite difficult to access, although as we know hostile states have lots of tools to their capability, so they probably could if they really wanted to. I guess my question would be, why would they really wanted to access a list of our wanted offenders across London?
If they could identify dissidents would be the reason, I think.
They wouldn't, I'm not sure, we wouldn't have, unless a dissident was wanted for a crime which fell into our watch list, then they wouldn't be on the watch list in the first place.
That's not true, is it? Because of the answer to Nottinghamshire, where a number of people were on there who were not wanted for a crime.
The watch lists, wanted criminals is one aspect of watch lists. We've already talked a little bit about victims, witnesses. What we don't have is a watch list category for dissidents. We can't rule it out, a dissident going on there, but I can't, off the top of my head, think of an example of why and when. I don't know.
I think the answer to the question of what would they want it for, they may want it to blackmail the police for money because they don't know what they're going to use it for. People hack into people's systems not because they necessarily want the information.
Yeah.
That information is valuable to the police and will be valuable as a tool to extract money.
Taking a step back, if they hacked into the system and if there was a picture of a dissident on the system, what would they have access to? It's a closed system, and the watch list is retained just for the period of 24 hours of the deployment. So they could potentially access a photo of the dissident, which they may already have. And I'm not really sure what else they'd have access to.
There would be no identifier in terms of things like address, contact details and things like that. None of those sort of types of private information is held within the system.
It's a name and a picture.
It's an identification.
It's just one picture, but if they access the system with a whole lot of pictures in it, and they could then say, these are the people the police are interested in, which you might not want to disclose to the public generally.
So that comes back to the fact the watch list created for the deployment is only kept for 24 hours and is specific to that case. So even if they access that, they wouldn't have access to the whole system of images that the police have as part of their custody image database. That's a entirely.
There are technical questions I won't go into, which what they could do to effectively be part of the watch list without being visibly part of the watch list, but that's for another day and another witness, I think.
So you've been using the language dissident, but if I substitute protester for that, the answer's the same?
So yes, the answer is the same. I think the concern that we would have as professional police colleagues would be not the accessing of this data, but the accessing of the wider police data. So the Police National Database, which is the system that holds the breadth of information that allows you to understand the picture of an individual, where they are, who they are, their associates. The accessing of something like that would be really fundamental in terms of those risks, which is why we have such significant safeguards to those elements. What we're talking about here is I'm not saying it's not significant to the individual, it's a small snapshot of that data that is divorced from their what we call nominal data, which would prevent, unless you knew who the person was. So for example, a hostile state, knowing who an individual was, would be able to identify a photo and match that photo. If you didn't know that, because you weren't a hostile state, it would have no bearing or no benefit in terms of intelligence picture for anybody.
Professor Young, do you want to come in on all this? And I wonder whether there are any useful international comparators. I say useful because there are different legal systems and so on. So if they're not comparable, then it doesn't necessarily have a read across.
Thank you. So I think it is useful to locate the discussion that we're having in this room with the larger international context. I'm sure everyone is familiar with the objections to the use of this technology by civil society organisations, for example. So, for example, in Europe alone, it has been banned entirely in Luxembourg and in Belgium. The AI Act now makes it basically banned in Europe once it is active, subject to very limited law enforcement exception requiring prior judicial authorization and only for specific serious crimes. So much, much more limited than is currently being used here in the UK. It is used everywhere in China and it is the norm. And there is a question about whether that is the kind of political community we wish to be. And I think that's where we need to be mindful of the fact that we are an outlier as a democratic state in the pace at which we are embracing these technologies.
Thank you. Well, we've mentioned ethics committees, and one could say we should have started with questions about ethics. Baroness Hennig.
Yes, can I just say, it's been a really interesting session, not just in terms of specific focus questions, but also raising some very broad issues that we clearly can't deal with today. But the more it's gone on, the more I realise how important an ethics focus is going to be, because given the lack of a kind of agreed legal foundation, ethics then becomes, in a way, the place where a lot of these issues can be raised. So perhaps I could ask Karen about the use of ethics committees. Is there a common framework for them? Do they just spring up ad hoc? How do they operate? Can you perhaps tell us something about them?
Yes, so that's actually a really good question. I don't have specific expertise. There is, in fact, a study that was done and reported in August this year, which I can give you the reference for, where a study was undertaken on the 43 policing localities. And it turns out, based on a survey, that a substantial majority of police forces do have an ethics committee. There is no generalised framework or structure. They were largely divided into two types. The first type used their ethics committee largely as a kind of expert panel for ad hoc ethical dilemmas. The other one incorporated ethics committees into their internal governance structure, and they incorporated a whole range of kinds of reporting that included human resources questions, for example. So there's quite a diversity of ways in which these committees are set up. They are increasingly being used. There's no obligation to use them, and of course the advice from an ethics committee is not binding.
I'll defer to Guy, because I know we're short of time, and in a way he's going to take this forward.
Right. I've got some specific questions which are really sort of yes or no answers.
Forgive me.
Oh, sorry.
Apologies.
First of all, directed to Deputy Chief Constable Travis. The South Wales Police committee, ethics committee, is an independent committee. Don't we need a national data ethics model on a statutory basis with national guidance?
I'm going to answer your question accurately, so I need to use more than one word. I apologise. We have an internal and an external ethics committee who support us. The complexity of this area of business that has been highlighted today and has just been discussed, I think it would be beneficial if there was a form of central reference that had subject matter expertise in a complex area. Whether that's statutory or how that is formed, I think is a recommendation or a decision for other people. But would we want to have that facility and that support to make effective decisions? I think that would be a benefit to us.
And I didn't realise you had two committees. Can you just explain the difference?
So the internal ethics committee are people from our own organisations who make observations and recommendations about challenging questions. The external ethics committee is made up of professionals, predominantly with a professional educational background, who form a committee who then can, if necessary, go directly to the Chief Constable with any form of challenge.
They're dealing with what I'd call the policy rather than the day-to-day issues.
They will deal with everything from staffing, the way that Professor Young described that, from policy and procedure through to staffing issues, issues around equality, all sorts of things. Yes. They have looked at the issue of...
their decisions are minuted, am I correct?
They're minuted and they're publicly shared.
And if the force decides not to follow a recommendation, is that minuted or on a matter of public record?
Yes.
Good. Can I now turn, therefore, to the Metropolitan Police? Who appoints the members of your ethics committee? I'm talking about the Metropolitan Police one.
It's the London Policing Ethics Panel, and I believe they're appointed by the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime, I think.
And does it publish minutes?
Yes, it does, on the MOPAC website. And actually on the Met's, they commissioned a report on our use of live facial recognition, which is also published, including the response by the Met about how it was going to meet the 5 conditions for the ethical deployment of the technology. That's all available on the website.
But presumably the Metropolitan Police isn't obliged to follow a recommendation, or is it?
It's not statutory, but why wouldn't we follow 5 very good, sensible recommendations for the ethical deployment of the kit? I think from a MOPAC oversight perspective, the ethics panel, when it comes to new and innovative technology or sensitive processing, as it is in this case, MOPAC would look to see and check and oversee the fact we are responding to the LPEP recommendations.
And is it a matter of public record then if there is a non-following by the police?
Well, we've written to show how we would follow it. I can't imagine a circumstance where we wouldn't. We could write to them and tell them we wouldn't.
All right. And would you also agree that it would be helpful to have national guidance and possibly put on a statutory basis?
I think there is some work across policing. It's not my area of expertise to bring together a national data ethics board, and that would be really useful. I think other places we also go to are the Centre for the CDEI, Centre for Data Ethics and Integrity, and also the Alan Turing Institute have been really useful in terms of help and advice when it comes to data ethics. But there is some national work. I'm not sure how far advanced it's got.
We have slightly gone over, but let's see if members have got any further short questions, presuming on your ability to stay for another 2 minutes. Actually, no. I think for some members this is something of a revelation. It certainly was to those of us who were on the committee a couple of years ago and doing this work. And as Baroness Hennig has said, the more questions you ask, the more questions you want to ask. Is there anything that you would like to leave with us, to the witnesses, that you feel we've not properly covered or that you would like just to amplify?
So the last question was in relation to police and crime oversight and scrutiny. The Police and Crime Commissioner structure within South Wales and the Mayor structure within the Metropolitan Police are very keen to get this right on the back of the complexity that exists around this position. We're very keen as police officers to get this right, and you suggested a number of things today that we will take away and that we will consider. We are very open to those suggestions and recommendations in terms of how we move this area forward. And we recognise the significant impact that the use of technology has, and which is why we are so determined to manage this in the most effective way that we can. Thank you for your time.
Professor Young.
I just have two brief comments. One of them is the importance of recognising that because the technology operates at scale, it has the capacity to change the default political and constitutional culture and environment in which we move about lawfully in public spaces. And that, I think, is easily lost in these discussions. So I just want to remind the committee of that. The second piece that I want to emphasise is, even though the claim is that the intervention is minimal, you need to remember that there is a really stigmatising effect in being singled out by a police officer as you are going about your lawful business in public. And as a non-white woman, I'm very conscious of the way in which that can have a differential impact as I move about the world, and particularly in airports, for example, in a very troubling way. And I just want to remind the committee of the reality of that experience. Thank you.
The point that Lord Beath was making, I'm not sure. Would I catch you at the January sales or at a football match, Lord Beath? I'm not sure. Thank you all very much to our witnesses. This is a very short inquiry, too short for the subject, but it's the best we can do in the time we've got available before the membership of this committee changes. And we did want to use this opportunity to pursue points which we identified a couple of years ago, but knowing that life, technologies moves on. And it's quite hard to keep up and be on top of it. Thank you all very much indeed. That concludes the public part of this meeting. Thank you very much.
Has ended. The proceeding 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 has ended.